walking around your neighbourhood, cycling to school, cycling to work where it remains viable, looking at getting on the train, getting on the buses, using the ferries, car sharing where you need to, means that the road network is available for those who really do need to use it.
Welcome back to Infrastructure Connections, the podcast where we explore what makes sustainable infrastructure work. Brought to you by the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I'm your host, Seth Scott, and today we'll be speaking with Dr. Cathy Bebelman. Cathy is the Chief Scientist, Head of Science and Sustainability with Auckland Transport in New Zealand. Cathy has an extensive background in the environmental impacts of infrastructure and transport networks, working as a researcher and consultant in the public sector for over 25 years. She advocates for a holistic approach to the management of climate and the environment. Hi, Cathy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Seth. It's really cool to be joining you.
Great to have you on. So let's set the scene, because I know a lot of what we're going to talk about today has a starting point of Cyclone Gabrielle.
A national state of emergency has been declared as Cyclone Gabrielle causes destruction right across the North Island.
Meteorologists say a month's worth of rain fell on New Zealand's largest city in the last 24 hours alone.
The Prime Minister here has called this weather event the most significant one we've faced this century.
Cyclone Gabrielle remains as an intense, powerful and very broad weather system.
So that was 2023 when Auckland got hit by this major storm and caused a lot of disruption to Auckland Transport and other systems. So tell us about that. What did it do to Auckland Transport's networks and infrastructure?
Sure. There were two storm events pretty close together. So we had the Auckland anniversary storm event and the last weekend of January, followed a fortnight later by Cyclone Gabrielle. So the impact of Cyclone Gabrielle was probably a lot worse because of the storm events we'd had a fortnight earlier. So the combination of those two events led to in excess of 2,000 landslides across our road network, substantial flooding across the region, but really it was focused particularly in the north and west of Auckland.
And how's that changed the way that Auckland Transport looks at the work that they're doing around future storms?
Yeah, that's provided us with an awful lot of data. Typically our response has been to any disruption like this on the network is everyone wants us to build back better and open the road quickly again, of course. And so our road corridor maintenance teams get out there and clear the slip, for example, clear any drains that have been blocked by debris that have shifted in the rainfall, that kind of thing, so that the road and operations can resume as fast as possible. But what we've learnt from that is in our haste to build back and recreate those networks and access ways for people, sometimes we are building back in areas that are going to remain susceptible to risk in the future, particularly from substantial storm events. And we're starting to question the cost of that. And we've done a lot of work now to understand what that cost looks like in terms of prevention versus building back. And we can talk a little bit about that. But it's starting to help us understand that sometimes we might want to build back differently in those areas or provide alternative access routes rather than just constantly relying on one route.
But on the other hand, you have mentioned that it's better to spend that a little bit extra upfront now rather than have to rebuild the infrastructure when it's completely wiped out later. I understand you've done some studies on that. How does that work out percentage-wise?
Yeah, we've used the data that we got from that Cyclone Gabrielle Auckland anniversary events, and we've done some really detailed case study assessments now on a dozen or so locations where we had really serious underslips. So an underslip is where the road falls down the hill. An overslip is where the road above falls onto the road. That's easily cleared with diggers, for example, but an underslip is where the land falls away. And building back in those areas is really expensive because the land no longer exists. And so we're having to either buy new land or work magic in terms of bridges, etc., and retaining structures. So the studies we've done have really focused on some of those underslip areas where we've learned that the cost of reinstating that road network is typically, on simple ones, around $1 million a slip. But for between 15 and 30% of that cost, we probably could have prevented it. And that prevention includes things like understanding the overland flow path, where the water might go during heavy rainfall across that road, looking at the condition of the pavement, understanding the integrity of the retaining wall that may be holding up that section, for example, that kind of thing. And by ensuring that those things are in sound condition, we could have gone a long way to preventing that stuff. So that cost of sort of 15 up to 30% in some instances is what we would refer to as an opportunity to prevent rather than paying to recover.
So how would you compare budgets before the storm versus budgets after the storm? How much are you allocating towards that extra 15 to 30% to make sure current assets survive versus the budget that you allow for replacing assets if there's another storm tomorrow?
We're not funded in that way. So the way AT is funded is not as simple as just going, I'm going to set aside a whole lot of budget now in case we've got another storm event. It doesn't work like that. So we get our funding from about 50% comes from NZTA and about 50% comes from council. And they, in addition, we receive the fares from public transport. But if I'm looking at our at our main funding sources, it's NZTA and council. So where central government has changed policy or approach, for example, with the new government policy statement for land transport now diverting funding through to building roads of national significance, repairing potholes, it's reduced funding on things like walking and cycling, public transport, for example. And while it talks about resilience, there's no funding pot for resilience. And so we're guided or we're constrained, if you like, by the funding buckets that NZTA has been given by central government. And we're funded on an annual basis. So while we have a 3-year program, it's on an annual basis, and we don't get to retain funding year upon year to build up a big pot like you might for your household, for example, where you put some money away each week to save for a rainy day. That's not how we work. And so we have to spend the money that we get every year, and then we get a new budget for the next year, and then we carry on. So it's kind of complicated and slightly weird, but the funding for resilience is not part of that mix unless we're able to do it as part of a standard renewals and maintenance program.
It's interesting you don't have a rainy day fund for literal rainy days.
No, not at all. And I think one of the challenges we have is, when we had Cyclone Gabrielle and the storm event the fortnight earlier, it cost us around $360 million to build back the damage to that road network. And that came with a lot of assistance from NZTA and Crown infrastructure partners. So from central government, they've coughed out with a big pot of money. And central government has since indicated that, local government councils can't keep relying on central government to cough up funding. So central government also funded Auckland Council to buy out a lot of the affected residential properties from that storm event as well. And so that signal coming now from central government is, well, that rainy day fund has kind of run out, people. We're not coming to the party. You need to do it yourself. And so that's a really hard conversation we need to start having. And what we're doing at Auckland Transport, through some of the case studies and detailed assessments of the storm events we've had, is to say, hey, for 15% of the cost, roughly, of recovery, we could have prevented this. Hey, central government, why don't we start looking at those funding tools and mechanisms that you use, say, through NZTA, to look at how we could set up a resilience fund for New Zealand. Every 2 years, roughly, we have major storm events. It might not be in Auckland, but where Tairāwhiti was hit. Now we've had the Tasman district, the Ashburton area has gone underwater. We've had the Invercargill and Southland. It's not isolated to Auckland. Northland in previous years has been wiped out with floods and cyclones. So New Zealand as a whole needs to be having this conversation on how do we make our networks more resilient.
Because those storms seem inevitable at this point, and they happen frequently.
They're not going away. They're not going away.
Yeah. During the storm, I remember I was walking down Queen Street. I walked up Queen Street to see it, and the Waihoratu, which usually runs under Queen Street, and the traditional river that still runs underneath the city, was running on top of Queen Street. It was pretty amazing.
It is pretty amazing to see. And I think we were seeing the flooding across the region was phenomenal. And there's lots of footage, of cars being caught on the road network, for example, and things like that. But the thing about flooding is that those waters do recede. They tend not to hang around for weeks, and then we're left with the resulting damage and cleanup. And it's a little bit different to, say, landslides, where the damage does just sit there until it's removed. And so there's different costs and implications associated with that.
Well, I think one of the very forward-looking things that AT is doing is electrifying everything, which has been great. Auckland has electric trains, it has electric buses in the fleet. Now we have electric ferries on the water. I know there have been a few setbacks, but what's the overall feeling around electrification of transport?
Oh, really excited. Really excited. To have electrified the train fleet is huge, but we've also got the biggest electrified bus fleet in the South Pacific, and super excited about it. And we've got a map now that's walking us towards fully electrified fleet by 2035 at this point. So that offers an enormous improvement, even to, say, human health through the improvements to air pollution. And people don't think about the wider benefits of that electrification. So from a way that Auckland Transport is looking to transition to a low-carbon resilient network, those are a big part of what we do. And we've summarised a lot of this work in the Auckland Transport Climate Transition Plan that's available on the website. So really exciting to see now that all documented and modelled out to 2050. So we can really understand what part electrification of our public transport fleet plays in reducing the emissions on our network.
Well, I'm glad you brought up congestion, because you were a panelist on Carbon Crunch and you made a good point. You said that people need to understand that they are the congestion.
Yeah,
What's
so
the
to my
process
point,
behind that?
Exactly. So every time you're sitting in the car complaining that, you're stuck in a traffic jam or you're parked on the southern motorway, you're part of the problem. So I think it's about understanding that, yes, we're a very car-centric city at the moment, but I'm seeing that starting to move as we get back to our pre-COVID passenger numbers on our public transport network, for example, as more people take up walking and cycling and other ways of getting around Auckland. Again, it comes back to the comments I made on that autonomous vehicle. Every time we add a new car to the road, we're adding to that slowdown of congestion. It would be really cool if the road and cars, and that's freight services as well, if that roadway was available to the people who really needed to use it, and the people who had an opportunity to use public transport or an alternative mode took that opportunity up.
And what are those alternatives right now, or plan to be?
Well, we're looking at things like improving walking and cycling. It's not flavour of the month with central government at this point, and we saw that clearly signalled 2 years ago with the government policy statement on land transport, removing funding from that space. But ultimately, walking around your neighbourhood, cycling to school, cycling to work where it remains viable, looking at getting on the train, getting on the buses, using the ferries, car sharing where you need to, means that the road network is available for those who really do need to use it.
We have the existing fabric of the city that's kind of standing in the way of new developments or new routes. How does AT strategize around that existing fabric, literally standing in the way?
we've got a few examples now across the region where we don't have enough lanes. Redoubt Road in Manukau has been done in the last couple of years, where there are a fixed number of lanes, there is a fixed road width, but we recognise that in the afternoon peak we want more traffic going this way, in the morning peak we want more traffic going the other way, and so by using lighting and signals we can add extra lanes. You see it on the Harbour Bridge all the time, where they're moving that central median barrier just to accommodate those flows, to improve the efficiency at different times of day. And I think we've got enormous opportunity to look more carefully at that space before we go knocking over rows of houses.
I've seen that on several roads. I thought it was very clever
Exactly.
idea.
But it's a serious win-win because it requires less infrastructure. It's a whole lot cheaper. It reduces the carbon emissions associated with the build. It's quicker to do, so there's less disruption for average traffic users. I can't see any negatives about it.
So I understand right now that the government is trying to increase densification in the cities, especially around the transport hubs. How does that change the transport strategy for AT?
No, I think it plays right into it. So we're really excited now to see that transport-orientated development happening, say, around the new CRL station locations, where we can start building an intensification of housing and just where people live, being very accessible to those transport solutions. It means not everybody in the house has to have a car. What an unusual idea that might be. And less parking required. So it allows people to live and work and move around a whole lot more easily. So that plays exactly into the direction that we're heading. Where we see that challenge play out is where we've got that greenfield sprawl happening. And where, in contrast, we're turning into LA, and we all hold up LA and other cities around the world as a horror of concrete highways and congestion, and we go, oh, we don't want to be that. But this constant sprawl around the fringes and using up that green space makes it really hard to put in effective infrastructure. And I think there was studies done by the Productivity Commission in Australia recently where they identified the cost of to productivity of greenfield development versus brownfield. So brownfield being the already built environment being redeveloped and intensified. So there was a massive cost and infrastructure requirements associated with that greenfield space compared to what's required with redeveloping what we already have.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm thinking of Warkworth, which is 60 kilometers away. Some people don't realize how big Auckland really is and the amount of spread and sprawl that we're seeing, which is quite large. How are you tackling people who live that far away or those developments that are coming online as far as the public transport sector goes?
Yeah, it's a real challenge in terms of providing fast, frequent and reliable public transport services. In the north, we rely a whole lot less on trains, for example, and Warkworth, of course, doesn't have ferry access, so we're delivering bus networks in that space. And so you put on a bus service, and that's what we've done. But if you were to actually focus on the transport nodes, which is where we'd like to see that further greater development to accommodate more Aucklanders, that is where you get a better bang for your buck in terms of people being able to move around more easily.
And it's good that Auckland Transport has that electrification aspect to it, because I know that as the sprawl continues, we get more car use, and that car use results in a lot more pollution. How does AT look at health as a benefit to the community based on what the transport decisions that AT makes?
Yeah, I think you'll find Auckland Council has done a series of studies, and they release data every year or two on air quality in Auckland, and recent data from them is still indicating, hundreds of premature deaths in Auckland every year from air pollution. and we're finding continued increase in the parameters that we monitor or Council, NZTA and NIWA monitor, things like NOx, NO2, particulate matter, and we're looking there at PM 2.5, so the really small microscopic particles that cause the most damage in our lungs. And those particles and parameters are monitored continuously through monitoring sites by Auckland Council, and that data is publicly available, so we can see where we've had an impact on air quality, for example, by shifting all the buses that run through that area to electric buses.
That's great. And access to transport also impacts equity. How would you describe those impacts?
Yeah, equity is about recognising that not everybody has the same access or opportunity to access our transport network, or options around the way they move around. Equality means everyone's got the same opportunities, but equity takes into account that some people may have fewer options. And as we transition, I think, to a low carbon and more resilient transport system in Auckland, we need to think really carefully around what that equity lens looks like. And I think it's something we've been looking at quite closely, say around the transport pricing, where we may look at making the motorway, for example, have a pricing cost or congestion cost, which will push people into local roads. But that has an impact on people, say, driving from South or West Auckland, who may not have transport options available to them at the time they need to get to work. And so they're forced to drive through that, and that becomes a penalty for them as a cost factor. So there's lots of ways of looking at it. One of the real challenges we have is around, say, our bus operations, and many of our routes are insufficiently patronised. That means there's not enough people using the bus to pay for that bus service on a commercial basis, and so we get subsidies from NZTA to run those services, which is good and proper and appropriate. But the challenge when money gets tight and those subsidies are reduced is to look at, say, some of those services that are perhaps into lower socioeconomic parts of Auckland and go, well, not enough people use it, so maybe we'll take it away. And that becomes a real equity issue for those communities in that they are forced back into using a car, and we take away those transport choices. So it's a really challenging discussion around how do we provide choice for Aucklanders. If you live in the central Isthmus area, you've got heaps of public transport choices. But as you go further out, it gets fewer. And it gets more expensive for us to deliver. So it's really understanding those trade-offs.
And of course, talking about equity brings up the elephant in the room, I think, which is politics. I know recently you spoke with the panel and you mentioned the fact that we all around the world, we are dealing with polarized governments right now. And there seems to be a flip when one government comes into place. They have different policies than the last one. Here in New Zealand, unfortunately, we're very proud of those electric ferries that have come out, but the current government has decided to move away from that and went back to diesel ferries, which is not very climate friendly. How do you get through those swings in politics, and how do you see kind of the silver lining on the other side of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think being sustainability professionals, Seth, I mean, you're working in this world as well, you kind of watch and listen to some of the political rhetoric, be it within New Zealand or even internationally, and you just go, really? But I think you've got to remember that we operate within a political world, and those political cycles for New Zealand come every 3 years. And I kind of like to think of it as a wave, and the waves crash on the shore every 3 years. And it's about learning to ride those waves and not get bogged down in the rhetoric. I think, though, when I tend to treat that political stuff as noise. Because when I'm talking to, say, corporate New Zealand who are manufacturing and exporting into that international market, they're just doubling down on a lot of the climate requirements, such as understanding and reporting their emissions, building resilience into the way they manufacture and deliver because of the climate hazard that are intensifying. And so, despite the political noise, New Zealand businesses often are just doubling down and getting it done. I think they're talking about it less, but no one's stopped.
That all sounds very positive, but what do you see are the biggest challenges facing infrastructure today?
I think the biggest challenge is that it's aging, that we've built infrastructure over the years and we've done it really well. But, we might have built it with a 50-year design life and now we're sitting on 46 years, for example, and we're coming to the end of that life and we hadn't set aside funding to actually renew it. And that depreciation funding was swiped for something else. So the biggest challenge is looking at our ageing infrastructure in New Zealand and wondering, what are we going to do about this? But I see a couple of things that would have helped us along the way. Firstly, a whole of life approach would have been a better outcome. So rather than just building stuff because we've got capital money to spend, we need to build stuff that we can afford to maintain, and maintain in ways that is not going to be onerous or hard to access or require just very bespoke solutions. New Zealand is too small to constantly build bespoke infrastructure. There are people in places around the world for whom stormwater networks, water networks, roads, etc. are bread and butter. Let's learn from that and build this cookie cutter stuff that doesn't require bespoke, expensive maintenance.
What do you see as the potential infrastructure of tomorrow? What excites you about it?
Oh, I see the opportunity to integrate nature into our infrastructure, to actually take that bigger picture lens, to look at where we build and how we can integrate nature into our urban environment, to look at reusing and repurposing the assets we currently have rather than just assuming we've got to keep building new stuff. I see a really cool opportunity to now build that urban fabric in the way we'd like to live. That's what makes it really exciting, and to do it in a way that provides a cool environment for the people who live there, who don't get to see nature every day. We can bring nature into them through green roofs, green walls, street trees, rain gardens, in that kind of way.
That's a fantastic vision. So
keep walking in that direction.
That's right. We got to work towards it. Well, I'm going to end on a very serious note with a serious question. How bad are human drivers? Because it seems like the one problem with the network of transportation that we have is the human element, of course, and the driving especially. And wouldn't that strengthen the argument for more public transport and mode shift?
Of course it would. Of course. But you know what? If you go and ask New Zealand drivers who the best drivers are, it's always them. Who are the worst drivers? It's always the other people.
Well, I would agree with that.
Of course. But if you look at our crash and deaths and serious injuries rate on a world standing, we're not too flash. So clearly the other drivers are at fault. Yeah,
setting aside climate and congestion and all the other issues, I find that to be one of the best impacts of public transport is just the fact that you have a reliable source of transport that doesn't depend on the whims of human drivers.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it, Cathy.
My pleasure. It was nice talking to you.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to another episode of Infrastructure Connections. Please take a moment to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we want your feedback. Leave a comment down below to let us know your thoughts, or drop us a line at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. Stay tuned for the next episode of Infrastructure Connections.